One, two, three. One, two, three. Two. One, two, one, two, one, two, one, two. Two, 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 two. One, two. See, it's not broke up once for us. As long as people want, yeah, I'm gonna Could you possibly just say that you really appreciate that you switch off? It's not so much the ringtone, it's the signal can interfere. So
Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure.
Hi, David.
Yeah. Remember to turn it on.
yes, that's my only. Can I just check the battery for you? That is now on.
Yeah.
I said I'd do it.
Okay. I know you really can't keep it this one, but we'll see what happens. If it's becoming a struggle, we do have this microphone available as well. So
Oh, all right. It's a handheld.
yeah, it's just for a backup and for Cynthia. So
Okay.
thanks, David.
Thank you.
Before we get started, could I just make a request that if you have mobile phones, that you turn them off? I've been told by technical services that the problem is not even about the ringtones. The problem is that the signals, they create havoc with the system here. So if you could turn off your mobile phones, that would be greatly appreciated.
Turn off mine as well.
Lord Lieutenant of Merseyside, Dame Lorna Muirhead, the Lord Mayor of Liverpool, Councillor Tony Conception, Vice Chancellor of the University of Liverpool, Professor Janet Beer, our own Vice Chancellor, Professor Gerald Pillay, members of the Governing Council, representatives from the many schools and colleges across the region here in attendance, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second annual Hopkins Lecture organized by the Department of English at Liverpool Hope University. The Hopkins Lecture recognizes the connection between Gerard Manley Hopkins and St. Francis Xavier, the church at Liverpool Hope's creative campus, where there is now a Hopkins Hall and a Hopkins Garden. Hopkins, a priest, lived in the presbytery at 8 Salisbury Street, between the church and the St. Francis Xavier College. He moved to Liverpool at the end of 1879 and stayed until the summer of 1881. During his time in Liverpool, he wrote 2 of his greatest poems, Felix Randall and Spring and Fall. The Hopkins Lecture this afternoon will be presented by Professor David Crystal. It is a great honor to introduce this eminent and engaging speaker to you. David Crystal, OBE, for services to English language, is a fellow of the British Academy, a founding fellow of the Learned Society of Wales, and a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Linguists. He is a patron of the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language and of the Association for Language Learning. He is president of the UK National Literacy Association and an honorary vice president of the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists, the Institute of Linguists, and the Society for Editors and Proofreaders. He is a past honorary president of the National Association for Professionals Concerned with Language-Impaired Children, the International Association of Forensic Phonetics, and the Society of Indexers. He was the Sam Wanamaker Fellow at Shakespeare's Globe in 2003-04 and Honorary President of the Johnson Society in 2005-06. He has also served on the board of the British Council and the English-Speaking Union. BBC audiences know David Crystal for his radio and television work, such as The Story of English. He has produced over 120 books as author, co-author, and editor. He is the author of the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Language, the Cambridge Encyclopedia of the English Language, and has edited the Cambridge Biographical Dictionary, the Cambridge Fact Finder, the Cambridge Encyclopedia, and the New Penguin Encyclopedia. His most recent books, and we are just talking about the last 2 years, include You Say Potato, and I have to thank you for not getting me into the controversy over tomato and tomato. It's, we wouldn't call the whole thing off, but thank you as an American speaker. A book about accents published in 2014 with his son, the actor Ben Crystal. The Oxford Illustrated Shakespeare Dictionary, 2015, also with his son. The Disappearing Dictionary, A Treasury of Lost English Dialect Words, 2015. And Making a Point, The Pernickety Story of English Punctuation, 2015. Pernickety in the US.
Persnickety.
Persnickety, okay. I won't go on. If I were to list all his publications, productions, commitments, and honors, we would have no time to listen to his talk. But I would just add that, as with Hopkins, Liverpool does have some right to claim David Crystal for its own. His family moved here in 1951 and he received his secondary schooling at St. Mary's College. Professor Crystal will be speaking today on Where Have All the Dialect Words Gone? Hopkins and a Disappearing Dictionary. So, without further ado, I'm delighted and honored to be able to present him to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for that. It's a delight to be back here. No, sorry. It's a delight to be back here. You all right? You all right? Yeah. I mean, I'm from Wales now, you see. I live in Holyhead, and I'm used to talking like this all the time. I mean, it's nice to get back into the old accent every now and again. Oh, dear. Yes, it's a joy. Thank you so much for asking me to deliver the Hopkins lecture this year. The Hopkins lecture this year. From now on, I shall call it the Hopkins lecture, of course. It's a great idea. Hopkins turns up in so many different contexts. I mean, you know him from his literary and theological contexts, of course. But I wonder whether you had encountered him in a linguistic context before. I had only a vague understanding of his link with linguistics. But after this talk, I now know exactly what it is. Now, I'm slightly worried about the quality of the lapel microphone, and I think maybe, should I use the handheld? That'd probably be better, because it's the beard, you see. It gets in the way. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, the beard gets in the way. When I go into school sometime, they either call me Gandalf or Dumbledore. I never quite know which is the most pleasant of the two. Gandalf, probably. Still, yes. I don't know whether you knew about Hopkins' relationship with language, and this is partly what I'm going to talk about this evening. But in order to put it into context, I need to give you the introductory remarks about the Disappearing Dictionary, and what is that? And the dialect words, and where have they all gone? So let's start talking about dialect for a few minutes. Dialect, it's always in the news. More than dialect and accent together, always in the news. Every week I look up online to see what the language stories are, and there's always one or two, and almost always it's going to be accents or dialects. They sort of get to people in a way that other subjects don't. And why? Why do people get so fascinated, upset often about accents and dialects? And it's because they express identity, who we are. There are two big forces that drive language always. The need for intelligibility, we have to understand each other. And then the need for identity, we have to say who we are and where we're from. And the intelligibility argument leads to the head. That's an intellectual thing. That produces standard English. And a standard Southern, in this country, accent, General American in the United States, and so on. An accent and a dialect that everybody learns in school if they don't speak it or encounter it naturally. And that's for intelligibility purposes. And then identity, which speaks to the heart, who you are and where you're from, and which group of people you belong to, and which group of people you don't belong to. That's dialect and accent. The difference, of course, accent is to do with pronunciation, dialect is grammar and vocabulary. This evening, I'm talking about the vocabulary side of our identity. And it's the most difficult side to talk about, actually. Why? Well, because if I'm interested in accents, that's the sounds of my language. How many sounds are there in the accent I'm using now? How many vowels? How many consonants? Well, if you know your linguistics, you'll know there are 44. And we've got to write them with 26 letters, as you know, hence the problem of spelling. But still, 44. That's not a big deal. You know, you can study 44 sounds. It's tricky at times, but it's not going to take you a lifetime. 44 is relatively easy. Or take grammar. If you're studying grammar, how much grammar is there in the English language? Well, if you get a big grammar, like the big comprehensive grammar of the English language, which is that thick, 1,800 pages, and if you go to the index at the back of the book and you count up all the items in the index, you will find there are 3,500 items in there. That's how much grammar there is in English, 3,500 items worth. And if you weigh the book, it's 2.4 kilograms. That's how much grammar there is in English, 2.4 kilos of it. But even so, 3,500, not a big deal. I mean, you can study grammar and feel you're going to get to the end of the story, even though it might take you a few years to do so. But vocabulary is the Everest of language, bigger than Everest, because there is no limit to the size of a language's vocabulary. And if you start studying vocabulary, it's going to take you a lifetime and beyond, because how many words are there in the English language? All right, what am I bid? How many words are there in the English language, please? A lot. Do you know, I knew I'd get that. This is Liverpool. A lot. It is the perfect answer. People get they tend to underestimate the number of words in a language, you know. They tend to do that. But if you count them up, well, what have you got? You've got the big Oxford English Dictionary, unabridged, 600,000 words in that. Go to America, to the Webster, biggest dictionary in America, 600,000 words in that. But they're not the same words. I know, because I've compared them. You put the Oxford down there and the Webster down there, and you start at letter A. And you go, that one's in, that one's in, that one's in. And then after a day, you get fed up. But you get an idea of how much difference there is between the two dictionaries. And, of course, there are lots of American dialect words in the American dictionary, lots of British dialect words in the British dictionary. It's about a third difference in vocabulary. So that's 600 and 400. There's a million there before you start. And when you actually go to the Oxford or the Webster, you'll find that there are lots of other words that aren't in there either. because many of the technical terms of physics and chemistry and botany and zoology and so on, the really technical terms, they're not in these general dictionaries. You need specialized dictionaries for those. So that's going to add another, what, 500,000 or 1 million more? I don't know. And we haven't started yet, because what about all the abbreviations that there are in the language? How many abbreviations are there in the English language? You know, BBC, ITV, that sort of thing. Well, there is a book called Gale's Dictionary of Acronyms, Initialisms and Abbreviations, I think it's called. It's very, very thick, and it contains 500,000 abbreviations. And every time I come across an abbreviation and look it up in Gale, it isn't there. So it's at least 500,000. So add that onto the total as well. And then you've got to go around the English-speaking world, because English is now spoken by 2 billion people around the world, in places like South Africa and Ghana and Nigeria and Singapore and India and Bangladesh and all the places many of you come from. I've met some of you this evening. And nobody knows how many distinctive words there are in those parts of the world. There are some dictionaries around. The Dictionary of South African English, for example, consists of 10,000 words and idioms that are used only in South Africa and nowhere else. You know, so you've got to add that kind of thing on. You know the sort of thing I mean. I remember we were driving along the road in South Africa and I see a sign and it says, "Robot ahead." And I turn to the driver and I say, "What's a robot?" And he says, "What's a robot?" I say, "Yes, what's a robot?" "You don't know what a robot is?" "No, I don't know what a robot is." "A robot," he says, "is a traffic light." That's all. A traffic light. It's the South African word for traffic light. So people in South African English say things like, "The robot is broken," or "Turn left at the robot." "My shop is opposite the robot." And if you didn't know, you'd think, had they landed? But once you know, you know. And there are 10,000 more words like that. Borrowings, of course, from Afrikaans and Xhosa and Zulu and all the other languages of South Africa. So who knows how many words there are in the English language? But people tend to underestimate these words because an awful lot of them are dialect words, and people underestimate those as well. I'm remembering now a story I read, a headline in The Guardian, I think it was, some years ago now, which said, "The average number of words known by a reader of the Sun newspaper is 500. Well, The Guardian would say that, wouldn't it? Well, when I read that headline, I thought, that's absurd. And then I thought, I better check. Linguists, as you know, are sad people. So I did. I got a copy of The Sun and counted all the words in it. It was not the most exciting day of my life, but it was fascinating. Now, actually, it's easier done than you might think, because it was an online version of The Sun. So all I had to do was pour some beer down a tame programmer and say, "Would you mind taking this online version, listing all the words in alphabetical order, grouping them into types rather than tokens, and see how many there are?" And he did. And do you know how many words there were? How many different words? I mean, different words there were in that one edition of The Sun? And the answer is 8,000. So 500 is a complete underestimate, you see, 8,000. 2011 was the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. I did the same job for that, because people said, how many different words are there in the King James Bible? I didn't know the answer, so we did the same exercise. You know how many words there are in the King James Bible? Excluding proper names, of course. We're not counting names like Adam and Eve, because they're not really linguistic in the same sense. Answer? 8,000. King James Bible, Sun newspaper. Discuss. Well, there we are. So, that's the number of words there are in the English language, and an awful lot of them are dialect words. Well, how many of those words do you know? You know. How many are in your head of those millions and millions? Any estimates for that out there? How many words do you know? And isn't it interesting that you have no idea, that your mind goes blank at this point? Or you'll make a guess, but what guess is coming into your head? 1,000? No, obviously, if the sun is wrong. 5,000? 10,000? Going up? Anybody want to do more than that? 15,000? 20? This is how you find out. When you get home tonight and you're lying in your bed, reach down by the side of your bed to the dictionary that is there. What? What? Do I detect from the response that some of you do not have a dictionary by the side of your bed? Hillary, dear, oh dear. Yeah, I have a dictionary, both sides of the bed. I mean, you never know which side of the bed you're going to end up on. I mean, if you don't have a dictionary by the side of your bed, what are you going to do in the middle of the night when you wake up and you want to check the meaning of a word? You don't do that either. Oh well. This is what you do. Find a dictionary. A college-sized dictionary, that sort of thickness, say the Oxford, concise Oxford or something like that. Contains about, say, 1,500 to 2,000 pages. It will contain somewhere between 100 and 150,000 words, right? That sort of size. Choose a number of pages from the dictionary, say 20 or 30, however, do the lot if you've got the time, and then go through and either mentally or with a little pencil or on a piece of paper, tick the words you know. 10, 20 pages. Add them up. Multiply, as it were, by the number of pages in the dictionary, if you follow me, and you'll get a rough idea about how many words you know. This is the sort of thing you do. So let's go to the page happy. You know that? That's one. Happily, yes? Happiness. Happy-go-lucky. Hapthene. Ah, well, depends. Are you a chemist? Then you'll tick it. If you're not, you won't. That's what you do. Tick, tick, tick. No, tick, tick. If you're not sure, don't count it. None of you, if you do that exercise, have a vocabulary of less than 50,000 words. 50,000. No kidding. I've done this dozens and dozens of times with people from all sorts of educational backgrounds. The more you read, of course, and the more well-educated you are, the more specialist you are, that figure will go up and up and up. So I would expect a learned professor at a university who is a specialist in some subjects or other to have at least 100,000. That was my total anyway. Or just over. But there's 150,000 words in the dictionary, so I only know 2/3 of the words in the dictionary, and I'm a bleeding linguist, for heaven's sake. I mean, you know. But still, somewhere between 50 and 100,000 words, that's what we're talking about here, which is a lot, but of course only a fraction of the total number of words that are in the language. Now, to get on to the point about dialect, an awful lot of those words that you and I know, but exactly how many are local dialect words. Words that actually may not be in the dictionary that you've just used because they are local to Liverpool or wherever. And so you won't find them there. So actually your total number of words, because if you've got a dialect background, will be larger than the ones that you'll get from the dictionary, if you follow me. And so let's move on to that question now. How on earth do you find out about dialect words? How do we do it? There are two ways. One is you go to them. The other is they come to you. Now, you go to them. What you have to do now, and some dialectologists spent years doing this, I'm thinking now of the great Stanley Ellis, that some of you may remember. Those of you over a certain age, not to be rude about anybody, but still, if you were around in the 1970s and 80s listening to Radio 4, you'll have heard two series on language, one by me, called English Now, I'm not talking about that. And the other by Stanley Ellis, and it was called Words of the Town, Words of the Country. And Stanley used to go around the country in his caravan, with his caravan, and look at a likely place, a farm, drive up to the farm, knock on the door, and say, you know, hello, you don't know me, hello, you don't know me, I'm Stanley Ellis. He was from Yorkshire, you see. And I'm at the survey of dialects at the University of Leeds, and I'd like to find out some of the words you use. And you might think, you know, go away. Not so. Not so. Not when people ask about your language. People don't say go away. They say, come in and let me tell you. They are so thrilled that you're interested in their language. It's not like some other things, but language gets you in that way. It's this identity thing again, you see. People love to have their identity explored in this way. So Stanley would stay around, and then he'd say, you know, what do you call that field? What do you call that hedge? What's the word you have for the young of a cow? And all that sort of thing. And he would get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of responses in that way. And he wasn't the only one doing this. So that's one of the ways you find dialect words. You go to them. The other way is to stay put in your university world, because it's usually the universities that do this, sometimes the museums, and you ask the dialect words to come to you. In other words, I write to you, or these days send you an email or something, and say, send me in your dialect words. And thousands of people are very happy to do that. And that is the story of the first English dialect dictionary. The English dialect dictionary, gathered together by Professor Joseph Wright of the University of Oxford at the end of the 19th century, published in 6 volumes between 1898 and 1905. The first time that anybody had ever tried to collect all the dialect words from the British Isles. England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. Ireland, of course, then. Not Northern Ireland, but the whole of Ireland. The Joseph Wright story, the most amazing story in the history of linguistics. You will never have encountered a story like this. Joseph Wright started off in a little village in Yorkshire. And when he was 5, he was sent to work in the local village as a donkey boy. A donkey boy is the boy who guides the donkey pulling the cart that goes around the blacksmiths and all the farmers and picks up tools and brings them to be sharpened and then brought back again. That's the job you do, and you earn a couple of pence a day. He did that for a year or so. And then he went up in the world. He got a job in the local textile mill, local cotton mill. Now we're talking about Saltaire, which many of you will know because it's a World Heritage Site these days. The cotton mill there, introduced by Sir Joseph Salt, a great philanthropist. Joseph Wright worked there as a doffer. A doffer, that's the little lad who runs around all the cotton machines, and every one, if you've seen cotton machines, they have cotton reels on the top, very large ones, and they get empty after a while, and you have to replace them with a full one. And that's his job. That's what a doffer does. Takes the empty one off, puts the full one back on. He did that for a few years. And then he decided it was time to learn to read and write. Joseph Salt had sent him to school, along with others. Salt started a school at Saltaire. Wright says in his biography later, I learnt nothing at that school. They taught me to pray and a few other things, but I didn't learn much. So he taught himself to read and write by reading the Bible and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And very successfully, too, he says. And then he started to learn other languages. He had an interest in language because his ear had been tuned. You think, what are you doing all this time going around all the mills and everything? Well, he was listening to accents and dialects and dialect words, and something in him started to click here, and he thought, I'm going to learn other languages now. So he learned French, taught himself Latin, taught himself shorthand. This was the period when Isaac Pitman was developing, we're talking 1850s, you see, the period when Isaac Pitman was developing his shorthand system. He earned enough to be able to set himself up as a teacher for evening classes, which brought him in some money. When he had enough money, he took himself off to Heidelberg in Germany to do a degree. He got it, stayed on, did some postgraduate work, came back into this country, we're talking 1870s, 1880s now, Hopkins time, and eventually became Professor of Comparative Philology at the University of Oxford. From donkey boy to professor. I have never heard a story like that, ever. And round about 1880, well, earlier actually, in the sense that he was always interested in dialects, but round about the end of the 70s, early 80s, the Philological Society at the time said, we must have a dialect dictionary. We need one. Who can edit it? And they unanimously chose Wright. And he began, and he started to circulate questionnaires around every contact he could possibly get hold of. And the words started to come in, bit by bit by bit, and then into a flood. So that by 1896, he had millions of slips of paper. For those of you who are under a certain age, I must explain. This was a time when if you wanted to send something to somebody, you had to get a piece of paper and write on it in a thing called a pen or a pencil, and it's called handwriting. You then put this into a thing called an envelope. You stick down the envelope using your tongue, and on the front you put a stamp, and then you write the address in handwriting on the front of the envelope, and then you put it in a thing called a post box, and then it comes maybe 2 or 3 days later to the recipient. I'm only half joking. I was in a primary school not so long ago, and they were amazed at this technology. Amazed. Wow. Anyway, Wright gets these slips of people from all over the kingdom telling him local dialect words. And he puts them together into these very large volumes. 6 of them, in fact. Very large and very heavy. And here is one of them. This is just letter A. Well, A to C, actually. And if you want to have a look at it later, you can see it here. Letter A alone had 1.5 million slips of paper, each one containing an example of a dialect word or a dialect sense. The books, the 6 books as a whole, contain 117,500 entries. It was an enormous labour of love. And each entry has got pronunciation, etymology, the background, the senses, examples of usage, real examples of usage. That's the point. That's what makes a dictionary come alive. And just in case you were wondering what all this has got to do with the Hopkins lecture, when you go to the front of the book and look at the list of collections sent in by individuals, you will see on this page Hopkins, Reverend G.M., brackets, Ireland, close brackets. Yes, Hopkins was one of the contributors to the English Dialect Dictionary. Unsurprising, perhaps, because we know from the way Hopkins wrote how enthused he was by local words, Anglo-Saxon words in particular. He had a distaste for the highfalutin French and Latin vocabulary, just like his contemporary William Barnes, the Dorsetshire poet, did. But Hopkins had moved about an awful lot, unlike Barnes. And so he was interested in dialect variation. His first references to it are very early on in his letters. And he was interested in the dialect words he encountered around Liverpool way. And when he went to Ireland, he bored his colleagues to tears by asking them where this word comes from, where that word comes from, how are you pronouncing that word, would you mind saying it again, I'd like to get it written down, all of that. He had this fascination with dialect. And so he started to collect. At the front of the dialect dictionary, there's 3 categories of people. Voluntary readers. These are people who simply send in, they're reading something and they come across a dialect word, so they send it in, you see. Then there are people called correspondents, and these are a sort of grade up, if you like. These are people who have committed themselves to sending in stuff at regular intervals over the period, the whole period of the dictionary being written, which was 6 years, you see. And then in the middle, the list of unprinted collections. Collections now. So these are people who have actually locally collected as many dialect words as they could find and put them together into a little book, but not printed it because, well, who might be interested in it being published? You know, they've just kept it to themselves, probably. People do this. People still do this. Every so often I get a collection through the post saying, you know, dear David, I've been collecting these words for 50 years, the words that we have round here, and I'm not for this life much longer. You know, I do. No, I thought you'd like them. What am I going to do with them? What we need in this country is an English language museum, an English language house, an English language archive, in which one can locate things of this kind. There is a project underway at the moment at the University of Winchester to do such a thing, to build online at least, and eventually, hopefully, a physical building called, at the moment, the English Project. You can look it up in Google, englishproject.com or something it is. And they are hoping to develop such a thing, but we could do with more than one. How many museums are there in the country? How many natural history museums? How many libraries are there? Any of these places could, of course, act as a focus for this kind of collection. At the time, there was only Joseph Wright, but he became known throughout the land as the person to send stuff to. Sorry, that was Beard again. The person to send stuff to. The person to send stuff to. And people did. And Hopkins was one. How many words did Hopkins send? That's the next question. How many entries did Hopkins send? Until recently, what you had to do was go through it page by page by page, looking out for the initials GMH when they turned up. Now, there are thousands of words on each page, and the print is very small. And you can imagine how long it would take somebody to do the whole thing. So people never did the whole thing, with one solitary exception, a man called Norman White, whom some of you will know as a great Hopkins scholar. It must have taken him months. And even at the end, would he be sure that he'd got every one, that you've noticed every little abbreviation like that? No, not at all. The cavalry, of course, arrives in the form of the internet and in the form of the University of Innsbruck. And a couple of years ago, Innsbruck, a team at the English department there, decided to put the whole of the English dialect dictionary online. And they have done so. In a beta version at the moment, as an improved one will be out later this year. So if you go to the University of Innsbruck website and click on projects, you will be able to search, once you've logged in or done all the necessaries, the EDD completely. And just last week, I thought, well, seeing as I'm giving the Hopkins lecture, it would be nice to announce exactly how many dialect contributions Hopkins made to the dictionary. So the kind gentleman at Innsbruck did a search for me, and found 89. 89. Which by some standards isn't a lot, but by other standards is amazing, really. Because some people sent in just small numbers in their collections. 89 is really quite a lot. Let me give you some examples of the words. These are mainly Irish words, you see. Mainly Irish, mainly Irish, mainly Irish, mainly Irish, mainly Irish. Let me give you some examples. At all. You know, at all. I'll go over here. How's this? Yes. At all. Yeah, there we are. That's a good Irish one, isn't it? I'm doing this at all. Yeah, that's good. To ballyrag somebody. And to abuse somebody violently, that's another one. Begob and begorra and all of those. Words that you associate with Ireland, but, you know, they'd not been collected and written down in that way before Wright did so. A boreen, a jigger, all right, jigger. A boreen, a narrow lane, a byroad, a passage behind houses, a boreen, you know. You're a boss-toon, you're a big awkward fella. A witless, senseless, tactless fella. A creepy, a low-legged stool, a three-legged stool, a creepy. And then there are some that reflect Hopkins' own religious background, you see. We've got a craw thumper. Who is a craw thumper? C-R-A-W. This is the definition Wright gives. A term of ridicule for a very devout person who, in praying, beats his breast. And this is Hopkins' definition. One who thumps, heavily beats the craw, the breast, in saying the Confiteor or other prayers. Yeah. I confess, my fault, thump. Well, apparently Hopkins used to watch these people doing this and he couldn't stand it. He wasn't one for over expressiveness, it would seem. That's the sort of thing that you get there. And so now the question is, of course, what's happening in Liverpool? How many Liverpool words are there in the English Dialect Dictionary? Not very many, actually. Or at least not very many that mention Liverpool specifically. And the reason is that Wright was more interested in broad areas than individual locations. He was interested in Lancashire, he was interested in Cheshire, the main counties of the time, rather than individual cities. And so some of the words that were used in this particular area will be not just Liverpudlian, they will go beyond Liverpool and be into the Lancashire countryside to some extent. What I've done is I've pulled out a dozen or a little more of words that Wright says were used in this part of the world 100 years ago. Question for you is, are they still being used? And probably not, but I don't know. Let's see. A cough, slightly, sharply. A kettle. Kettle? No. Kettle, no. A bit of rubbish. You open a drawer in your house and there's all sorts of bits and pieces, dust and rubbish and so on in there. It's a flunter. Flunter. F-L-U-N-T-E-R. Anybody heard that one? Flunter. That one's gone. That one's gone, yeah. You're very, very sulky, very vexed. You're melancholy. Madancholy. Based on melancholy, obviously. Madancholy. Anybody been melancholy recently? No, that one's gone. All right. give us, if you're a beggar, and there were lots of beggars in those days, of course, they would shout out, "Palmus, Palmus, your palm, yeah, Palmus, give us some money, Palmus, Palmus, no, no, no." You're in a state of great excitement, to the point almost of vexation. You're in a state of puckeration. Puckeration. That's an interesting one. From Puck, you see. Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream, Puck, P-U-C-K, puckeration. Puck being a spirit of some kind. What about this one? You make yourself scarce, you absent yourself, you're scarcifying. I'm scarcified, he's scarcified, he's gone off, he's made himself scarce to scarcify. No? Where have all the dialect words gone indeed? I fell over headlong, sticklebutt. I fell over sticklebutt. No. Give you a blow across the ear or something. I've given you a thusk. A thusk. No, gone. And then the one that the Liverpool Echo was so interested in, and also I'm on television at the moment, by the way. Northwest recorded earlier in the day, and they were particularly interested in the word for if you're cross or irritable, you're very twazzy. Twazzy, T-W-A-Z-Z-Y. Anybody here know twazzy? Interesting. Now, here's a case in point, because I was interviewed by the Liverpool Echo a couple of weeks back, and I used twazzy as one of my examples. And I got an email this week from somebody from, I forget where, around here, saying, yes, I still use this, and I remember my gran using it all the time. So it might just be that twazzy is still around a little bit. So, yeah, well, 12 examples, no hits, really. Where have all the dialect words gone? Where indeed? And it was for this reason that I wrote my little book. Some of you have seen it outside when we were in the reception. This little thing. I mean, look at it. Pathetic, isn't it, really? Oh, you could do better, Dave. You could do better, really. No, the reason why I wrote this book, it's called The Disappearing Dictionary. And the dictionary that has disappeared is this one, you see. Because unless you're a specialist in language, how many of you knew that this book existed before, you see? Most people have never heard of Joseph Wright and his amazing story and the amazing collection, even though people are hugely interested in dialects, Yorkshire Dialect Society, Lancashire Dialect Society, and things like this. Nonetheless, this book has been lost sight of. And it was a couple of years ago when I thought, that is such a shame. We're in an age of celebration, aren't we, these days? Every time you get an anniversary or something, people celebrate it. Look at Shakespeare this year, for instance. And so I thought it's time to celebrate Joseph Wright's dictionary. So, yes, I called it the Disappearing Dictionary, but it's referring to this one. It is a dictionary that ought not to have disappeared. And now that it's available online, of course, it's much easier to access it and to just play with it. But, of course, online isn't the same. I mean, what you can't do online is sort of this sort of thing, Oh, look at that. Isn't that fantastic? Oh, look. Oh, I love that one. Not so easy on a screen. And, of course, smell it. Oh, it's lovely. This is a first edition. Well, indeed, it has to be, because it was only published once between 1898 and 1905. Wright paid for it himself. No publisher would touch it. They thought, it'll never sell. So he had to do a subscription list, which is how you sold books in those days. And at the back, you get a list of all the subscribers. And there are something like a couple of thousand of them. And they paid a guinea a time. It was published in bits to begin with, you see. And you subscribed to them. And then eventually it was all put together. And so he got his investment back, just about. But it was never published again. And so this is a very valuable book. This is mine. Not having it. But do come up afterwards and have a rummage through it if you'd like to have a look more closely at it. So that's the story. Where have all the dialect words gone indeed? What's happening these days in Liverpool, of course, is very interesting because the classical Liverpool dialect words, the ones that I learnt when I came over here for the first time, oh, did I learn quickly. One person in this room remembers very well, because when I arrived in Liverpool in 1951, I had a strong Welsh accent like this, right? This is how I spoke all the time. And I went to, first of all, St Edmunds in Waterloo, the primary school, and then went to St Mary's, as you know. And they all call me Taffy, as he still is, wherever he is in the room. And I was told in no uncertain terms, "Hey, Taffy, you don't speak like us. You speak like us or I'll lip you." Now, to lip somebody is to place the forehead at force against the lower lip. I did not know what lipping was, but I did not like the sound of it. So within 2 weeks, I'd lost my Welsh accent. And I was learning words like jigger and Judy and all the rest of them. But most of these words, you know, are very recent. 20th century words, most of them. Only a few of these Liverpool words go back into the 18th century. That was the time when the Liverpool dialect first really started to grow. The Mariners coming in and leaving words here, the Irish coming in and leaving words here. I was made up. Are you made up? Well, that's very Irish. You know, that's an Irish expression, and it came over here, it's settled in Liverpool. Didn't go anywhere else in the country as far as I know. I haven't found it anywhere else. Some of you may know of it, but no. And then you get, on top of those older words, the modern words that came in the 20th century, like jigger and Judy and cop, of course, for Anfield, 1926 for that one. There hasn't as yet been a complete collection in real detail, tracing the history of all Liverpool dialect words. But there's one coming out next year, and for a change, it isn't being written by me. By Tony Crowley of the University of Leeds, the big dialect centre. This time next year, you should see his I've seen bits of it. It's an amazing historical study of Liverpool dialect words, so keep your eyes open for that. So there we are. Dialect, an important aspect of all our beings, and unexpectedly, an encounter with Gerald Manley Hopkins, which made it, I thought, an excellent topic for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a fascinating and entertaining talk, Professor Crystal. We're very fortunate that he's agreed to answer questions. Could you, there's a roving mic available. Could you wait until the mic gets to you before asking the question, please? There's a question over there.
One over there.
Yeah.
There's always one that side and then one that side.
Can I just speak loudly instead? Wait for the microphone. Can I just ask quickly, did you work out how many words were in The Guardian by comparison?
Thank you. Yes, I did, as a matter of fact. And it wasn't that much more than the Sun, actually. Now, the figure was somewhere around about 10,000, as I recall, at that time. I can't remember the exact figure. It's too long ago. And nobody's asked me that question before, so I don't have it in my head. But it was around about 10,000. I thought it would be twice as many, but it wasn't. And I suspect the reason is that when you actually look at the subject matter of newspapers of that kind, it's a relatively restricted subject matter. You know, it doesn't cover life, the universe, and everything. It depends on the topics of the day. This doesn't, of course, add up to the total number of words that a Guardian reader would know throughout the whole year, because of course if I chose, say, Christmas, it'd be full of Christmassy words, and if I chose summer, it'd be full of summer words, and so on. But still, around about 10,000, about a third quarter as many again.
Any other questions?
One over there.
I wondered if you knew the origin of the word galoot and what it means.
Galoot.
Yes.
Nope. But I know where to look it up. That's the thing. What you do is, the easiest way, there are two possibilities. One is it might be in we're right, because an awful lot of Americanisms, and that is, chiefly an American expression, I think, come from English dialect expressions. And so you might find it in there. The second place to look is the online Oxford English Dictionary, the unabridged one. You can have a couple of free trials and then you have to subscribe, I'm afraid, but libraries and so on will have it. And it'll almost certainly be in there. If it isn't in there, then I don't know what you do. Then you have to start looking in all sorts of obscure places, and that's what I do for a living. I try and track down obscure, oh, thank you, bless you. I try and track down obscure items of this kind, but I don't have them in my head, I'm afraid. But that's what I'd look it up. Oh yes, that's what it means, a big awkward person, you're clumsy galoot, you crazy galoot, and so on. That's what it means, but where does it come from? That's its etymology, that's the tricky thing. And you can't guess. If Wright gives alternatives often, so do I. Here in my little book, I've just got 1,000 examples chosen from Wright. I chose examples that were, I thought were quite interesting. Something like a third of the examples in my little book, etymology unknown. We just don't know where the word comes from. And there are theories, of course. Lots of theories about where the word comes from. So you put some of those in. But are you can you be sure about this sort of thing? No. I'll give you a good example that Tony Crowley just sent me just the other day. You play marbles, but what are they round here? Ollies. Where does ollies come from? Yeah, what do you think?
A guy taught me the word is actually alleys, and it's short for alabaster.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's not what Tony thinks, although this is a very good example of how alternative ideas come to life. This is Tony Crowley's entry on ollies. It comes from olla, or olla, a piece of waste ground. Heard that? Some people heard that? Yeah, absolutely. Patch of wasteland where children played. And so you'd go to play on the olla. And so if you're playing on the olla, you're playing ollies. But, of course, to begin with, it wasn't necessarily marbles. Where are we? The serious game in Liverpool, he hasn't found examples of it until the 20th century, but it's probably a lot older than that. But here's another Liverpudlian one. Ollies is also used, apparently, by some of you people, according to Tony Crowley, to mean testicles. Here's an example from the Echo from a few years ago. What about that shot Pelly hit from way behind the halfway line, eh? Made that goalie drop his ollies. He was not dropping his marbles at that particular time. There is a ribald element in an awful lot of dialect words. You've got to have a thick skin for studying dialect. A lot of the words are rude. A lot of the words are risque. A lot of the words are sexist. Ooh, gosh, huge. This Wright's book reflects the male-dominated Victorian society all over the place. Interested in gender studies would have a field day with this. Absolutely. Indeed.
Going back to Ollie's, in Princess Park, there's a place in Princess Park called the Ollie.
Called the Ollie. Did you hear that? The back. Yeah, a place in Prince's Park called the Ollie. Right, piece of ground, piece of wasteland. Yeah, thank you.
Could I ask a question while we're waiting for
Yeah,
the
sure.
light to arrive? You were
Need to-
focused in looking at Joseph Wright's work. Obviously, you're looking at the British context, but a lot of similar endeavours were happening over Europe, across Europe. I'm thinking about George Venker in Germany, Gilles Guilleron in France.
Guilleron, yeah.
Guilleron. So what is it about that particular time period that preoccupied people with dialect?
Yes, you're absolutely right. The dialect movement was European-wide, and to some extent American as well, though not so much. And there were big dialect projects going on in Germany and France, and indeed a few other countries too. Indeed, this is perhaps partly where Wright got his own enthusiasm from, because at Heidelberg there was a dialect centre. Why? Well, because at the end of the 18th century, in the 1780s, was the discovery that started off the field of comparative philology. When somebody worked out that the languages like Latin and Greek and Sanskrit were so similar to each other that they must have had a common origin, even though that common origin no longer exists. And the person who first stated that was a man called Sir William Jones, and it led to the field of comparative philology. Philology, the study of the history of languages. Comparative, because you're comparing them all the time. That early language that no longer exists was called Indo-European, or Proto-Indo-European. And then people started to look at all the languages in the family, all the languages that are related, the Romance languages, the Germanic languages, and so on, and tried to see in detail the correspondences between all these different languages, what made them different, how they were similar, and the like. And so inevitably, after a while, you start looking at the dialects of those languages, because actually that's what you've got. You know, a language is actually just all the dialects that exist in that language. And so suddenly, after about 40, 50 years, we're talking 1840s, 1850s, the dialect surveys begin all over the place. Difficult work. Gilles Leron used to go around France on his bicycle.
It was his assistant I liked, Edmund.
Edmund, that's right.
Cycle.
Yeah, that's right. So all of that was going on at that particular time. And Wright was simply riding on the back of that wave, it seems to me.
Yeah, thank you. Has the mic caught up with the next?
There's one here. Yes. Who's going to get there first? Oh, you is.
Thank you. I noticed that in your book you list the words distributed by count. Sorry, I don't know where.
Sorry,
they're distributed by county.
Yes.
Now, that's clearly, well, I say clearly, perhaps it isn't a function of how you've selected them, and perhaps how Wright selected them, and it's something to do with the research process as well. But there are some counties that have an overwhelming number of dialect words. Yorkshire in particular does. And some others, you were talking about Liverpool, very, very few. Is there anything underlying that is, regardless of how you've selected or how the research process is selected, are there some areas of the country that just seem to be richer in dialect words than others?
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. Now, Wright had no idea what the answer to that question was. He was totally in the hands of the people who sent him stuff. And he did the best he could, writing to correspondents here and there, mainly people in the educational circuit, people like doctors and lawyers and clergymen and so on, and people who had a fair amount of time on their hands. A fair number of his correspondents are women, the wives of doctors and so on, who spent a lot of time working for Wright. But he was totally in the hands of these people, and so insofar as there is a very uneven coverage in the big dictionary, and therefore in mine, because I just was reflecting what Wright did, you see, it's purely serendipitous. It's purely a function of the amount of data that he could get. Now, when the big survey of English dialects started in Leeds in the middle of the 20th century, they did things much more systematically. And the reports that came in showed that, on the whole, there isn't that much difference between one part of the country and another once you forget about county boundaries. Yorkshire has more because Yorkshire is bigger. I mean, when you think of the whole of Yorkshire, it's enormous. Compare that with, Dorset or Kent or somewhere. So that's one factor. On the whole, if you go looking, and this is 100 years ago and 50 years ago, I'm not so sure what would happen today, you do find very similar totals. In other words, you see, what you do is you have a questionnaire, usually, and you say, what do you call this? What do you call that? What do you call the other? What do you call the lane that runs round the back of the houses? And everybody has got a local word for this. There is no sign of any difference anywhere you go. There's always some sort of local word. And so, depending upon the questions you ask, that's the basis of saying that there's, on the whole, a similarity of response. Having said that, as dialects, as traditional dialects have died away, they've died away faster in some places than others. So the dialects of the home counties, for example, the old dialects, have largely disappeared. And so if you did that study these days, you wouldn't find so many local words in Hertfordshire and Kent and Sussex, as you would still in Gloucestershire and Herefordshire and the like. But that kind of modern study, it's still going on. The guys are still doing it at Leeds and in a few other centres as well. And the internet is helping enormously in this respect. But those old words are, a lot of them, disappearing. Of course, some of them are being replaced now by the new words that are coming in, brought especially by the immigrant population, the multicultural populations that are so important in Liverpool and Manchester and Birmingham, London, Bradford, everywhere, really. And as you come in, there are 400 languages, community languages spoken in London these days. I don't know what the figure would be for Liverpool, but it'd be pretty high as well. And so, as a result, these people are now, just like in South Africa, the words are coming in from Afrikaans and Xhosa and Zulu to make South African English. So we're getting words being built into the local dialects of Liverpool and Bradford and Birmingham to produce these new dialect words here. And these have hardly been studied at all. This is the really fascinating future of dialect study. Anybody looking for a PhD or a thesis or something of that kind, this is a really great area. What does one mean by Chinese scouse, for instance? What actually is the linguistic basis of it? It'll be partly melody, partly intonation and accent and so on, but what vocabulary is in that community within Liverpool? You and I might not know these words, but as soon as you start talking to a group of people with that background, they would start dropping into the conversation words that only they know for this part of the world, and they wouldn't be known maybe in Manchester amongst the Chinese Mancunian community or the Chinese Brummagem community and so on. So this is a really fascinating area of new research.
Was there just one last question?
What's your favourite dialect word and why?
Thank you. You're not going to like this. I don't have one.
Oh, you're supposed to be a linguistic.
I know. It's terrible, isn't it? And the answer is because they're all my favourites. I mean, it's like asking a parent, which is your favourite child? And, one says, oh, well, it's Ben, isn't it? And then Stephen says, what about me? Oh, Stephen, you're my favourite as well, really. Honestly, yes, you are. If you're a linguist, you fall in love with everything, with words, with grammar even, with pronunciation, with spelling, with punctuation, the lot. And at the end of the day, you can't choose. My favourite is always the word I'm studying now. I like that. The word that is I'm exploring the history of. I mean, as I went through compiling the words for my little book, I didn't want to say goodbye to any of them, I mean, I'd spend perhaps an hour or two, maybe sometimes half a day, exploring the history of Toisy, for instance, and finding that it linked up with all sorts of other words like twist, and thinking, oh, I'll just spend another 5 minutes on this one, and then another 5, and then suddenly you realize it's lunchtime. And then you have to write it up in a little entry like that. So you leave out most of what you fell in love with, actually. But it's all there. I mean, I enjoyed the experience. And so for that reason, I find it genuinely difficult, impossible, can't be done. To choose a favourite.
Unfortunately, I think we have to end the questions there, but thank you for your questions.
Okay.
Distinguished guests, colleagues and students, it's my pleasure as Dean of the Faculty of the Arts and Humanities to thank Professor David Crystal for giving the annual Hopkins lecture tonight at Liverpool Hope. His lecture has been, I think, insightful, stimulating and certainly wonderful. I think we've all enjoyed it, and it's been a privilege to listen to this learned man. We thank him for sharing with us his thoughts and his ideas on the topic, where have all the dialect words gone? Hopkins and disappearing dictionary. And I personally enjoyed it when he referred to the Irish words, and I thought, Barine, yes, we still use that in Ireland, actually. So there are certain words here that haven't disappeared. So Hopkins lives today in a way. And I think Professor Crystal captures, in a way, the idea of language as a living entity. So it's really been a great pleasure to listen to him. I'd like to thank him for his lecture tonight, but I'd also like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Linda McLaughlin, Professor Cindy Hamilton, and indeed Jackie Sanders, who's been doing all the organisation with us tonight. Thank you very much for coming as well to this lecture. I wish each of you a safe journey home, and remind those of you who are invited to the evening dinner that this will take place on the ground floor of this building in the Arbour Room. So thank you very much, Professor Crystal. If we could say thank you with an applause, please.